4 people on the agenda today. I don't know if your pleasure is to come up at one time or individually, but it would be Sarah Myers-Kaufmuller, Director of Policy for Developmental Disabilities at IARF, Art Dykstra, Chief Executive Officer of Trinity Services, Gus Vandenbrink, Executive Director of the Sertoma Centre, and Greg O'Connor, Executive Director of Sparc. And if you could, as you begin your testimony, introduce yourself. And will the clerk please add Representative Mayfield to the roll? And as you begin, please introduce yourself with your name and who you're representing. And Sarah, are you going first?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, again, my name is Sarah Myers-Kaufmuller. I'm the Director of Policy for Developmental Disabilities at the Illinois Association of Rehab Facilities. So IARF is an association, for those who don't know, representing community-based agencies serving children and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities and serious mental illnesses in over 900 locations throughout the state. So for purposes of this subject matter hearing, I'm just here to provide sort of a brief introduction around the Community Integrated Living Arrangement SILA program, and then I'll let our IARF members do most of the talking about the background of the program as well as its sort of current state of affairs.
And before you begin, I have received a message from Mr. Evans that he is in fact listening and he is now busted, so you can proceed.
Sounds about right. So as most members, I think, are aware, this hearing is sort of a follow-up to a joint hearing that was held in December by the Senate and House Human Services committees after the publication of a couple of the articles from the Chicago Tribune. It was an investigative series around group homes. So I also want to just mention that, and folks should have gotten a copy, please let me know if you did not, but just as a little bit of a background around kind of what has transpired since the Tribune series, IARF provided some written testimony just around some recommendations that we made that we believe would really strengthen the SILA program, the OIG processes around investigating claims of abuse, neglect, and exploitation, and just so some of you are aware that may not know, we are working currently with the Senate, with DHS, OIG, and House staff around several bills. Representative Belloc is the sponsor of several of those, Senator Ryder in the Senate. So we are working actively on some changes that we'd like to see. So just to start, for SILAs, as defined in the SILA Licensure Act. A SILA is a living arrangement certified by a community mental health or developmental services agency under this act where 8 or fewer recipients with a mental illness or with a developmental disability reside under the supervision of an agency. So some examples include adult foster care where a participant lives in a home of a family to whom they are not related, assisted residential care, intermittent care, which is a group of individuals living together in a facility with intermittent on-site supervision, and then sort of the biggest one is our supported residential care, 24-hour care, which is a group of individuals living together in a facility with constant on-site care. So individuals who are eligible to participate in a SILA program must be 18 years of age or older, have a mental or developmental disability, and are in need of an array of services and supervised and a supervised living arrangement. So before, sort of as a little bit of background, before an individual can reside in a SILA, the individual and their guardian, the individual has to be deemed eligible for services. So to do that, the individual with their family, a guardian, meets with an independent service coordination agency, ISC. So the ISC works with the individual to identify their service needs and then completes what I think most folks know as the prioritization of urgency of need for services, so the PUNS forms. So once an individual has been selected off the PUNS, generally via sort of the attrition, of the state's waiver programs. They then work with the ISC agency to identify sort of area providers in their chosen region area to figure out what provider will best fit the services and supports that they are searching for. So at that point, they then choose, if it's a SCILA program, if they're looking for employment, if they're looking for day programming, all that kind of stuff. So I will sort of conclude just with kind of the current state of the SCILA program. So right now there are roughly 220 community agencies providing care to over 10,000 individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities in SCILA settings. So these individuals receive residential habilitation, personal support services, and supports under the direction of a team of individuals who help them kind of figure out their life goals, all with the intent of living life in the community and being a part of the community. So with that, I will introduce Art Dykstra with Trinity Services, who's going to give a little bit of the sort of history of the SCILA program.
And let me just add Representatives Manley and Sauer to the roll.
Thank you. And I also want to thank the chairs, Musman and Gable and Harris, for taking the time, and all you members this afternoon. What we're wanting to talk about are some things that are very important to us and obviously have a bearing on the quality of life for people with disabilities in Illinois. As Sarah mentioned, there's about 10,000 people living in SCILA environments across the state. My name is Art Dykstra. I was asked to give a little background. I would share the fact that this year begins my 50 years of working in disability services in Illinois. I've been facility director for 2 state-operated developmental centers, the regional director for developmental disabilities for the state of Illinois for 7 years. I was a policy advisor to the director of the Department of Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities. This summer I'll be CEO of Trinity going on 30 years. I've been an expert witness for the Justice Department. I've been a court-appointed monitor, a court-appointed arbiter, a fellow in the AIDD, and along the way I wrote a few books and publications. Today I want to talk about the history and some of the problems that are facing us. And I would say, just from the very beginning, that with respect to the staffing crisis being experienced today, I've never seen anything as bad in my entire 50 years. What I've tried to do in framing up today to give you some sense of the background is to share the problems from a systems perspective, trying to understand the individual elements as well as the interrelated actions. For me, as we have this conversation, it's not about blame, but it's about dynamics and the consequences of so many years of underfunding. If I were to name these comments, I would call them, there is no such thing as all of a sudden. I might also add that Trinity Services is one of the larger SCILA providers. We serve about 500 people in our residential programs on a statewide basis. And we also serve a number of people who have a dual diagnosis and also have complex medical conditions. We also serve people in ICFDDs. So what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about the background, where the SCILA program came from, reveal a little bit of the history, the current problems, and then talk a little bit about some of the recommendations. Before beginning, I think that I need to tell you that the SCILA program, I think, has been a wonderful program. And terrific things have happened for people in Illinois as a result of it. And there truly are great things going on. And I think it's a program that should be continued. It's, however, also as a program that is clearly suffering from a lack of resources. Let me take you back to the beginning. The beginning of the SCILA program began in 1989. That's when the first programs were funded. And quite frankly, at that point in time, they were referred to as vanilla SCILAs. And what they meant by that was the fact that the people being served in those programs were meant to be individuals who had greater skills, people we would refer to as being mild or moderately impaired. And it was very important that this was developed as an alternative to the ICFDDs, and at that time there was a program called supportive living arrangements. The key thing was that people were to live in their own home. And there was to be really no problems when we first admitted these folks. So all the individuals were not to have behavior problems, not to have complex medical problems, and they were all to be self-medicating. There was no need for nurses when that program began. As I said, what we taught our staff, and we try to do the same thing today, is you are working in somebody else's house, in somebody else's home. You're not working in a facility, and indeed it was to be community-based. So the people that were originally funded came from the waiting list of community providers all across the state of Illinois. And at that time, the individuals were chosen primarily on the basis of needs, not necessarily on wants. And at that time, Human Services was still adopting the philosophy of that the goal of the state was to serve the sickest and the poorest. At that time, the original people were funded at a rate of $30,000 a year. And for people in intermittent setting, it was $16,640 a year. 1989 was also the beginning of the case coordination services. Those folks you know who do pre-admission screening, determine Medicaid eligibility, and at that time were monitoring individuals in nursing homes. Let me share something that came from the literature when that program was being established, because this was reflective of the optimism and the intent of that program. This is what was said. Persons with disabilities, this is what the goal of ASILA was. Persons with disabilities living where and with whom they want to, for as long as they want to, and with the ongoing support needed to sustain that choice. In some of the things I've written, I often talk about the fact that we as human beings and we as organizations leak and stray. And you're going to see as we talk this afternoon, you can see we've leaked and strayed a little bit from that original optimism. So in the early years, what happened was that we started to experience incremental growth. But along the way, in the early 1990s, we started to see some referrals from the state-operated developmental centers, which is totally appropriate. But in 1993, a benchmark event occurred, and that was the Bogert versus the Bradley consent decree. And quite frankly, what that was about was talking about the people with developmental disabilities who were put in nursing homes, and they were there inappropriately. Long story short, with the work of the case coordination agencies, thousands of people were taken out of nursing homes, and many of those went into SILAs and other community options like the ICFDD program. What began to happen at that time, there began the realization that we needed more nurses in the SILA program. So this goes all the way back to 1993. The other thing, and by the way, one of the reasons I want to share that, today many of those people are today, because of their advanced age, dying in our SILA programs today. They stayed with us that long. Other things that began to happen with the SILA program in those years, we began to admit people where there was a family crisis. Someone died, someone was killed in an auto accident. The other thing that began to happen was that we began to admit people from DCFS programs, youth who were aging out, turning 22. And that became a problem, it became a challenge for the system because many of those people have been living on campus-based programs. That remains a challenge yet today. So let me share a key operating principle from that era that is actually applicable today, but let me share it with you because this is fundamental to, I think, some of the problems we're having. For people having problems in adjusting to the community, the philosophy and the practice was to keep people in their own homes, to bring in staff supports. Problems were viewed as being temporary. The idea was for the person to work through those problems and not to discharge them. We tried to serve the poor person in place. In subsequent years, in 1994, the state, with some criticism from the federal government at that time called HCFA, was asked to do some things with respect to the rate in particular. That was to separate room and board from some other costs. But what they asked for at that time was to create individualized rates for the people being served in SILA. As I mentioned previously, it was a grant of $30,000. Now a very elaborate formula was created that, in my mind, carries with it tremendous problems even today. But nevertheless, that formula was began to fund people in 1994. What that formula did not do, it did not address those exceptional needs of the people with a dual diagnosis, namely those people who have a mental illness and or intellectual or developmental disability. And indeed, there were problems with the model. Oh, bless you, I didn't see an angel came.
And if I can use this moment to just ask the clerk to please add Representative Mussman to the roll for Appropriations Human Services and Representative Mussman back in the chair.
If I could just wax a little nostalgic. In 1975, I was the regional director for adult disabilities in the Chicago metropolitan area. In March of 1975, I was approached by the Legal Aid Society, by the ACLU and others, and what they brought to me was their concerns about the fact that indeed individuals who had lesser abilities, people we might refer to as being severe or profoundly impaired, were basically stacking up in the mental health centers. In addition to that, what was being talked about was the fact that those people I mentioned that had a dual diagnosis were not being adequately served anywhere. One of the things that happened as a result of that consent decree was, in fact, that people began to be shifted to facilities for developmentally disabled. So what happened is that consent decree was, that lawsuit was filed in 1975, and work went on for many, many years. In 1992, Judge Staniak in Cook County realized that no progress was being made. So among the things that happened is he appointed me to be the arbiter of that lawsuit. And what that basically meant, it was my responsibility working with court monitors to determine whether or not the state was in compliance with how they were serving people with mental illness and developmental disabilities. So in fact, work began and many good things happened. The efforts became much more serious. A lot of good things were created in terms of medication protocols as well as a lot of training that was going on. One of the things that came evident at that period of time was these people were going to take a lot of resources. So what happened is there was many tensions, and I spent a lot of time talking to people from the DD division and the mental health division. No one had adequate resources to say, I want to serve that population. I understood it. They were falling through the cracks. But nevertheless, for the next 5 years, we did a lot of studying, a lot of good things happened. In 1997, we had a court hearing, and Judge Staniak asked me to render a verdict as to whether or not I thought the state of Illinois was in compliance with that consent decree. And before I rendered my opinion, this is what I said to him. This is what I worry about. For the last 5 years, in recognition of the fact that we're serving very difficult people who I consider to be in double jeopardy. They have both a mental illness and issues of mental impairment. The state has agreed to fund 30 or 40 of those individuals every year because they recognize they tax the system. They recognize they need more resources. And I said, here's my fear, Your Honor. My fear is if I say to you today, I think the state is in compliance, that funding will go away. You know what happened next, right? I was assured by the state that would never happen. And so indeed, I said I found the state to be in compliance. And the next year, that funding disappeared. And I would just tell you this, if that funding would have gone on from that day, those roughly 30 people times 20, we wouldn't have the big mess we have today. 600 people would be more appropriately placed and be shoehorned into places they don't belong. But that's why I took that so seriously, and I feared that would happen. But I did what I thought was right, and at that time, I indeed thought the state was in compliance. Later, in early 2002, you know that with your help and Governor Ryan, the Do the Right Thing campaign spent many hours and time with you, and that was the last time that a rate was given to direct support staff of $1 an hour through the Do the Right Thing campaign. In 2002, despite repeated efforts to seek additional funding for nurses and direct support staff, in 2002, the House passed Resolution 852. It was adopted by the General Assembly on May 31st of 2002. And the purpose was to formulate recommendations for the future funding of SILA. I also served on that task force. The task force made many, many recommendations. That task force did group. Among the things that the task force said was we need to increase the number of hours. We need to increase the number of hours from RNs from 1 hour a year to 12. And we need to increase the hours of LPNs from 1 to 12 also. As you might expect, no funding occurred for that either, in spite of it being a House resolution. The other important finding of that you read about in the Tribune was that it was highly recommended that there be supervisory staff attached to SILA programs across the state. Namely, what would that mean? It would mean that at night or in the evening hours, you'd have somebody who could visit from one home to another. That was also not fundable. I started to get agitated. In around 2007, I started to send more memos to people in the Developmental Disabilities Division, to the clinical directors and others. What I tried to call our attention was to two key principles, and this was the first, that what we needed to do, especially with those respect to people with dual diagnosis, to allow such persons to live in the community with enhanced supports and safeguards, and here's the key thought, and to address the growing recognition that such individuals clearly reduce the quality of life for other individuals when living in the same household. So in this lengthy memo, I pointed out to the fact that we had not developed any specialized environments for people who are causing that kind of a problem. And so let me just read one paragraph from that as I shared that, and I said this. As a result, today, 2007, 10 years ago, many current group homes that are being provided with the SILA program have a troubling mix of individuals, most of whom who would certainly not choose to live together. It is not uncommon for many individuals living in such homes to be in a constant state of fear with respect to the aggressive behavior of their housemates. This was not true of all the SILAs, certainly, but it was true of many of them. And then, through the hard work of some of you and others, in 2007, the legislature passed Senate Bill 574, which called for more nurses to be hired in the SILA program. And what it suggested that we needed more nurses and we needed to pay them more money. That legislation passed. Sad to say, the funding never passed. That was never implemented. So again, going back to 2007, the cry was made, we know we need more nurses. We weren't trying to fool anybody. We knew we had problems within the community. Since nothing happened, going on to 2009, the Developmental Disabilities Division created a special task force just to look at rates. Many people came together. It's probably the best work that's ever been done in Illinois, looking at a rate. And I wouldn't mislead you. All the things in that rate could not be funded, I'm aware of that. But my goodness, so much good work was done. And what was said again is that we need to pay attention to the model right now, including looking at the rate and the wages we pay direct support staff, as well as the need for more nurses. Once again, those recommendations are put aside because of the state's lack of fiscal resources. You can find that still today on the DHS website. In 2009, the decision was made to close the Howe Developmental Center, and 265 individuals were relocated to community settings and to other SODCs. What was interesting to me about that, in spite of all that previous conversation, the Howe Developmental Center was closed with no recognition from a financial perspective that we need to do something about the difficult people who are being relocated. Let me talk about the recent years. This is a good thing. In 2010, the DD division recognized the fact that there was a lot of people living in the community who were having a hard time basically living at home or living in these facilities, whether they're ICFDs or SILAs. Through an RFP process, a group was called the Illinois Crisis Prevention Network that, quite frankly, as a result of that RFP, the Hope Institute and Trinity were granted that contract. So what we knew then was this initiative was launched in recognition of the difficulties that some individuals were having living at home or in community settings. Last fiscal year, the crisis support teams on a statewide basis responded to 635 people who were at risk of losing their residential placement. Moving on, in September of 2011, Governor Quinn announced a plan to close the Jacksonville Developmental Center. The last residents left that facility in November of 2012. What was noteworthy about that effort was, I think sincerely, people were trying to use enhanced levels of person-centered planning to accomplish that end. My purpose in sharing that is not to comment on the merits of the closure, but rather to highlight a centerpiece of that endeavor, and that was to place individuals in four-person settings. Now, there was a reason for that. There was a couple reasons for that. One of the things that had been occurring, this was true of Trinity and other providers as well, having no funding for so many years, what began to happen is that providers started to add people to the size of the home. In some instances, people converted garages to create 2 more bedrooms. Before, when 4 people were living at home, now 5 are. Before a person had their own bedroom, today 2 people are in a bedroom. That began, and the Quinn administration worried about that. At the same time, they looked at the fact that the federal government was offering a short-term, 1-year enhancement for putting in people into 4-person environments. So that option was selected. Now, most people, myself included, would not necessarily argue against having a home size of 4 or less. One of the things that usually allows is for people to have their own bedroom, which is something I support. But there are two realities that have to be faced in such development. The first is such settings are more costly. And we could talk about that if you wanted to. The second one, and this has a lot of bearing today, there are fewer and fewer staff available to develop those settings today. Quite frankly, the issue of size is one of those issues that needs to be resolved. It's my belief, just as a person, that one size doesn't fit all from my perspective. Then lastly, all of you are familiar with the Ligas versus Hamas consent decree. What happened there was that people put a consent decree basically after years of debate that suggested that people living in ICFDDs could, if they wanted to, move to alternative community settings other than an ICFDD. And it also began to serve people who were on waiting lists so that people could live in the community who wanted to. So what happened, as you know, just last year, the court-appointed monitor said Illinois was not found to be in compliance. As you would guess, the state of Illinois contend otherwise. Whatever the judge concludes, the primary issue from my perspective of noncompliance is the fact that civil movement and development is not occurring because community providers cannot recruit and hire staff, primarily because of the low wages. So let me go on to some of the current and major problems facing us today. So earlier I talked about the fact that we had this policy of keeping people in place no matter what the cost. And as I said in the beginning, that made sense. People didn't have the drastic problems that some of are sharing today. I still believe in that philosophy, but not for everybody. And that process needs to be strengthened as well. And so what we have argued and what we have suggested and what I have talked about any chance I have is a need to develop specialized homes for those individuals who are duly diagnosed, who have a developmental disability or a problem in mental illness. I'm pleased to say that I know at the present time the DD Division is looking at how to serve those people. Now, I'm granting you the fact that not everybody is living in this circumstance with a duly diagnosed person, but it's the growing population that's being referred to us. And that's a problem. And it's hundreds of people in that SILA program. So what I'd like to do is to take a couple of minutes and share with you the kind of referrals I'm talking about. So often when I share this with people, they're saying to me that, we're talking about people with Down syndrome. And sometimes we over-romanticize the people that we're serving. But I'd like to just share with you quickly 2 or 3 of the recent referrals we got and say to you, where should they be served? So here's the first individual. This is a young man. He has a moderate intellectual disability, attention deficit disorder, antisocial personality disorder, unspecified paraphilic disorders, including voyeurism, exhibition, and pedophilia. They use an eye bolt laser in his bedroom because of the severity of his behavior. There's door sensors throughout the whole house. His beds and dressers are bolted to the floor so he cannot move them. There are daily room checks. He needs 2 staff to be on duty all the time and to be within earshot of him. And other staff have to be within one arm's reach due to the severity of his behavior. His behavioral concerns include verbal aggression, physical aggression, property destruction, inappropriate sexual behavior, false allegations, and stealing. Obviously, due to the severity of his behavior, he's in a room by himself. Here's another individual. He's an older person, bipolar disorder, current episodes of depression, severe with psychotic features. This person has autism, epilepsy, attention deficit disorder, mood disorder, mild intellectual disability. She has struggled with harming herself over the last several years. She's been medically treated for stapling herself in her arms and legs with a stapler. She's been treated for chewing and swallowing hunks of metal. She's swallowed glass on several occasions. She's constantly cutting herself with glass. When she's struggling with her emotions and symptoms, she tends to engage in property damage, self-harming, aggression, and medication refusal. She has also in the past defecated at the program on multiple occasions and at times eats her own feces. It mentions she will destroy property in order to have self-harming tools. There's significant family dynamics where there was sexually acting out between her brothers and herself. Her mother also tried to commit suicide in front of her. And I say to you, when we refer to those people, where do you think they should be served? And then my heart goes out to the parents who call me and beg me on the phone, sometimes from psych hospitals, saying, Art, you got to help me. And so when you go to try to help those people, what do you think things that happens? You end up on the front page of the Tribune. And people say to you, how did you let that happen? Well, my question to you is, where should those people serve? Where should those people be served? What's happening now, a friend of mine said what's happened, Art, is we've moved from having vanilla SILAs to gorilla SILAs. We understand today we're serving a much more difficult population. What's happening today is that current capable providers are refusing to serve these individuals anymore. Inexperienced providers are trying to serve them, and I'll tell you, from my opinion, they're failing. Persons are being dropped off at psych hospitals because they don't know longer how to serve them. I know there's a psych hospital in Chicago today that they make a provider sign an affidavit that they'll take them back. Otherwise, they won't accept them back. Now what we see in the community across the state is providers going into court citing examples of domestic abuse or violence in the workplace complaints because people are beating each other up. Persons are now remaining in psych hospitals way beyond the point they should be. And people are now spending hours and days in emergency rooms in the state of Illinois. And the rights of housemates who are living in fear, I also contend, are being violated. Why, you might ask? I'll share a few thoughts. The inability to recruit and hire direct support staff. The inability to hire and recruit first-line supervisors. Inadequate rates. Increased lawsuits. The inability to discharge. There's a strange thing out there if you don't know about it. There's a gentleman in the room who knows much more about this than me, Mike Bible. But one of the things that we know, if you contrast an ICFD environment to a SILA environment, in a SILA environment, you have to move heaven and earth to move anybody out or discharge them. And I'm not talking about inappropriate discharges. In an ICFD environment, you can be fined or be found to be in immediate jeopardy if you don't move somebody out of a house who's beaten up his roommate. It's a bizarre set of circumstances. And we're now receiving more difficult referrals from SODCs as well as the community. And as I said before, we're living with an antiquated rate-setting methodology. And if you hear those packets I shared to you, here's one thing I guarantee you. If you serve those people, you've invited OIG into your agency. It's impossible when somebody's cutting themselves, when somebody's trying to commit suicide, when somebody's going after other people, not to have that kind of engagement. Let me just share one other thing in that context of what I consider to be the lack of best practices. And that has to do, in fact, with the referrals from psych hospitals. You may not be aware of this, but here's what happens. It typically happens when we get a referral, that'll be true of all of us. When you meet somebody, you say, we'd like to have you come and visit one of our homes, one of our SILAs. We'd like to meet the people there. If it's possible, we'd like to have you enjoy a meal with your new housemates. And we'd like to have you spend a night with them so we can see this is the right mix. It makes sense. That gives the person who's being referred a chance to say, maybe he doesn't like those people either. Or he might say, I don't like that house, I don't like that community. That doesn't happen with a referral from a psych unit. When people are referred to from a psych unit, the way the present Illinois rules work, they can't leave the hospital. If they leave the hospital, they're discharged. So what do you think happens there? Bad things happen. What happens is that you have aggression, you have property damage. We recently admitted such a person. Some of you have read about them. People who elope and you don't know it because they're in a locked unit. All you know is what people have shared with you, and you hope they've shared everything with you, but sometimes they do not. I'd like to read to you one paragraph from the DHS website about the SILA individual rate determination model. There's both a section C and a section C4 and C5, and they pretty much read the same, but in the interest of time, I'm going to read you one of them. Think about that again in terms of these difficult people I'm discussing. So this is an exact quote. For persons with unpredictable and unstable behaviors, which at times may require one-to-one staffing or one-to-one staffings for a determinable period of time, the SILA may be an appropriate setting. However, as with continuous medical needs, for persons with extreme unstable behaviors, which necessitate ongoing one-to-one staffing for indeterminate periods of time, it is the department's policy that settings other than SILA may provide a more appropriate environment at a more reasonable and economical cost. I have no idea what they're talking about. I don't know where those places are, but that's the people we're serving today, those people today who have continuous needs. The SILA rate model today, as it currently exists, has simply not kept up with the complexity of the people we are serving today. I'm just going to share a couple of things about the SILA rate model. The SILA rate model, many people indeed even tell me how great it is, and I say to them, that model is so good, why don't you use it to budget the state-operated developmental centers? I would tell you the average new provider today doesn't even understand the rate model. It's a very complicated formula. I'll just give you one example. The rate model is based on the notion of using prime time and non-prime time staff. And I think it was a system designed not to fund us adequately, quite frankly. So what happens is it's extremely difficult for employees to find employees who have a willingness to work less than full-time shifts. Therefore, providers typically have to pay for an additional full-time shift, 8 hours, versus the 4 hours that are provided in a SILA rate. There are no part-time DSPs that work only the 4 hours, considered prime time in a SILA rate model. The other thing I would share with you is that the SILA rate model does not adequately capture the individuals who with behavioral challenges based on the utilization of the ICAP, which is the inventory of client and agency planning. The other thing that happened that is very troubling to me, which I think is a discriminatory practice, as a result of the Jacksonville closure, for years, from the beginning of 1994, all of us knew that we were not funded for 2 hours of a day. And what people assumed that people were going to be gone longer than they were, and they thought people were going to need the services they need. So what happened, do you think, during the Jacksonville closure? Those providers who stepped forward and said, I will serve them, got the additional hours in their day. They're reimbursed today for 2 more hours. The rest of the people are not. The other 8,000 people living in SILAs don't have that same funding advantage. It's something I think is just appalling from my perspective.
Mr. Dykstra, in the advent of time, is it possible that we could finish up?
Absolutely.
And then while I have the microphone open, we would like to add Flowers and Hammond and Cassidy to the roll, please.
So let me just say, in the interest of time, that I could talk for the rest of this afternoon about the need for nursing staff. I just want to say one thing real quick. In the Quinn administration last year, I was asked to head up a nursing task force. We did that. They asked me to create a doable rate that, in fact, could be used across the system. We did that. We used an instrument called the HRSC, the Health Risk Screening Assessment. They told me had they been elected, they would implement it. They did not. It wasn't. Let me talk about the real crisis as I conclude this, the DSP workforce crisis, what I consider us to be playing with fire. As I said before, we're at a point I've never been at before in my 50 years. As a result of that is my judgment that people living in SILA have been, the quality of service has been going downhill, and the risk for bad things has been going up. We're surviving today basically on the basis of the willingness of our staff to work overtime. What's the primary problem? And this is the heart of what I want to share with you this afternoon. The heart of the problem is today, across the state, we need to have 2 people on duty in most of these group homes, especially the larger ones. The reality is, so often, we do not. So what do you think happens in a SILA home when there's not enough staff? One of the things that happens is sometimes it takes as long as an hour to pass medications. That person is passing meds subject to all kinds of distractions. If you have to shower somebody in the bathroom, you know that person needs individual attention. What's going on with the rest of the people in that home? Same thing with toileting. Somebody requires individual attention. Sometimes people have to wait because you don't have enough staff to take them to the bathroom. People elope while people are otherwise occupied. Persons can't get out into the community like they do, and those people I described as dually diagnosed oftentimes will act out and destroy property or run away. And then we're most vulnerable at mealtime. Recently, Representative Manley and Senator McGuire and others were at a meeting in Joliet, and we had a number of providers from Will County and South Cook County. And I just shared what I just shared there about the fact that we're most vulnerable on the PM shift. We're most vulnerable when we only have 1 person working instead of 2. And when I was done, a CEO stood up after me and said, can I share with you what Art's talking about? Let me tell you what just happened in our agency. What just happened in our agency, we needed to have 2 people on duty. And during an evening meal, a young man choked to death on a piece of fruit. And now she's being sued for negligence because she only had 1 person on duty. So I could tell you about all the things that are not happening as a result of that. People are not placing people in response to the League's consent decree. People are consolidating homes. People are closing homes on weekends. People are closing homes outright. We've already closed 5 homes, and we have 2 more that are probably going to occur. And with respect to recruitment, I have to share this before I sign off. We have done everything I know how, and in the written testimony I will share with you 40 things that we have tried to do to be able to recruit. Our recruitment efforts are not paying off because there's not enough money. Well, let me share a couple of things that have a tremendous impact on us, especially a problem in Will County because of all the warehouse and distribution centers. The average wage, I contend right now the average minimum wage in Will County is $13 an hour. The other thing that happened that really harmed us, and I'm not against people making more money, but in 2012, the legislature passed legislation raising the wages of personal care attendants to $13 an hour. We lost all kinds of employees because they could go and make another $4,000 or $5,000 a year. And I would just tell you this, as we consider the wage legislation, nothing under $13 will help us. Let me share this fact. Compounding the recruitment problem is the fact that among the candidates that do apply for employment, many cannot pass literacy tests, some have a disqualifying background checks, others cannot pass a drug test, others cannot drive because of their driving record. So I'll skip all of the things that I want to share about recruitment and all the things that we've tried and all that stuff, and I'll just go.
Perhaps maybe we can encourage you to come back and have some one-on-one visits with the members of the committee, or as you said, if you could provide written testimony for those things you didn't get a chance to touch on.
Can I just close and I'll be done?
Okay.
If I may do that. So in closing, I'd like to quote a colleague of ours, Nancy Davis, who shared this thought. In closing, the situation can be compared to the recent internet security company television commercial you've all seen. It features a bank robbery in which perplexed customers ask an unresponsive security guard to do something. His reply is, "Hey, I'm not a security guard. I'm a security monitor. I only notify people when there's a robbery." He pauses and then he deadpans, "There's a robbery." There could not be a more obvious sign that there is a crisis going on right now in front of us in Illinois. It might be tempting to respond to the negative events that are occurring by increasing levels of regulation, adding more personnel to the Office of Inspector General, or creating more frequent inspections of providers. However, these types of actions don't address the multifaceted questions or reasons for the crisis. In fact, more regulations without accompanying financial resources will only exacerbate the problems. In the words of the security guard, the commercial closes with, "Why monitor something? Why not fix it?" In conclusion, I really do want to thank you for allowing me to have this time. I know I've been going on for some time, and I take you up on the offer. I'd be glad to meet with anybody and discuss the situation in more detail. I've tried to shed light on the fact that with respect to the history and the dynamics of SILA, I realize that years of non-funding are now negatively impacting all human service organizations in Illinois. And I know you know that as well. But this is the hope I would leave you with. When you're seeking to provide 24-hour residential services to vulnerable people, your first responsibility is to keep people alive and free from harm. That's what's being tested in Illinois residential programs today. The people we serve deserve more, and so do the people who serve them, especially the direct support staff. And finally, I really want to thank all of you who have supported us in the wage legislation, those of you who have sponsored it. Thanks so much. I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dykstra. You are a wealth of information and passion, and we are grateful to have your guidance. Do we have an agreement among the members at the table still on who would be speaking next? Oh, your microphone, please.
There we go. Well, first of all, it's every provider's dread to speak after Art Dykstra because he is a wealth of knowledge and experience in the field. So Art really spoke eloquently, and I would ditto everything that he has said. Again, I want to thank you for your time to share information with you on community services that we provide at Sertoma Centre. I am Gus Vandenbrink, the Executive Director at Sertoma Centre, and we are located in Alsop, Illinois, which is a southwest suburb of the city of Chicago. I have been in my position for 24 years and have worked in community service agencies serving individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities for 38 years. Sertoma Centre was founded over 46 years ago and opened its first SILA home in 1991. We currently serve 62 individuals in 10 homes in the community, and then also some other individuals in intermittent SILA in their own or their family homes. The reason I'm here today is that I believe we are all here is because it really matters for the individuals with the intellectual and developmental disabilities who are really, I would say, our most vulnerable citizens in our state, that they should be provided quality services that are not going from crisis to crisis due to inadequate resources and planning. Community-based services such as the SILA program are the right type of services. They have contributed to the lives of many individuals. They allow an individual to live, work, and more fully participate in their community. Community integrated services are the future for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I truly believe that. Nationally, it is what all of the other states are working towards and is what recent guidance from federal CMS that requires of us that services funded through the Home and Community-Based Services Waiver, which is what SILA and day program services are funded by, it is required. Most importantly, community integrated services allow an individual to develop, grow, and experience the same life as another individual without a disability that they enjoy every day. Community integrated services are also the most cost-effective manner to provide services overall, and it's something that Illinois has benefited from as each administration has worked to downsize or close the state developmental centers. And they have continued to move more and more services into the community. As I'm sure you are aware and have heard before, the cost of serving an individual in the state-operated institution is approximately $250,000 a year. And I'll give you, they serve some of the most severe individuals. But the cost of the average SILA placement is approximately $55,000 a year. Thus, as Art has said, there's a just huge discrepancy, especially as greater needs are what the individuals have that are referred for SILA services. We are here today because Illinois has not put adequate resources into community integrated services as they moved more and more individuals into the community service system, and expecting individuals with greater numbers and with greater and greater medical and behavioral needs to be served in these community settings. Again, without adequate planning and development of reimbursement systems that provide the resources required. Community services such as a SILA program is one of the best bargains the state has versus institutional care, and still will be when they are funded adequately to accomplish their intended purpose. At Sertoma Centre, we pride ourselves at providing quality services in our residential and day programs, as well as in our employment services. Our mission is to provide opportunities that empower individuals with disabilities to achieve personal success. We are committed to our mission at Sertoma Centre and thought it is something we would never be forced to walk away from. However, I have to admit, over the past 2 years, this is a thought that comes to my mind more and more. And it's due to the financial realities that we are experiencing. Whereas about 4+ years ago, our net revenue for the community-based services we provide to individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities broke even or even generated some excess revenue to provide for building and equipment renewal. Now all of these services operate with significant deficits even after all of our fundraising dollars are contributed to support them. The SILA program and all community services for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities are really in jeopardy. At Sertoma, we are in jeopardy in the following ways. We currently have a $340,000 operating deficit through the 7th month of this fiscal year, something we've never experienced. Last year we squeaked by, the year before we squeaked by, this year we could not. 2, all of our intellectual and developmental disability programs, as I've said, operate at a loss even with our fundraising revenues contributed. 2 weeks ago, we laid off 5 staff as part of our effort to balance our budget. These position reductions included our medical resource coordinator, who coordinates all of the appointments and the medications for all the individuals in our 24-hour SILA program, as well as an employment specialist in our employment services program. Over the past 4 years, our turnover rate for DSPs, direct service professionals, has gone from 30% to over 40%, and we currently have 17 positions open that we cannot fill. We are not able to compete in the labor market, and that is due to low wages. We cannot afford to pay what the other employers, whether they're private or not-for-profits, hospitals, etc., can afford to pay. And on July 1st, 2017, the city of Chicago, which is our bordering neighbor, is increasing their minimum wage to $11 an hour, and from there, over the next few years, to $13 an hour. And the newly increased minimum wage for Cook County will be set at $10 an hour on July 1st, 2017. Since we are located in Cook County on the border of Chicago, this has a significant effect on our ability to hire. On July 1st, 2017, since we are located at where we are, we will be required to increase all of our line staff wages to a minimum of $10 an hour, which will increase our salary line item and related costs by over $125,000. Money we don't have, obviously, since we're running a deficit. In addition, that is only to bring everybody up to the bare minimum of $10 an hour. It does nothing for supervisors or wage compression for people who have been working at your agency for a number of years already. This is a huge problem I have no idea how we are going to overcome, and I'm sure other providers in our area are scratching their heads over the same thing. There is a huge problem. What community service providers do each day is very, very important, and we need your support to do it. Without action, planning, and adequate additional resources put into community services and the system, you will see more and more tragedies in the Chicago Tribune being reported on. You're also going to watch the slow demise and change of the community service system into something it was never intended to be, a shadow of what it is today. The best value you have in providing quality services is the community service system for serving people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I would duly respect that you please take some type of action to stop this from happening. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Vanderbrink. It looks like Mrs. Meyerkoff-Miller, will you be next? We're going to move on to Mr. O'Connor.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm Greg O'Connor, the CEO of Sparc, an organization founded in 1951, which aims to enrich the lives of people with developmental disabilities. Earlier today, Sparc hosted its annual breakfast celebrating the triumph of the human spirit. Some of you were kind enough to attend. The purpose of the event is twofold. It's an opportunity to update the community on our efforts, and it serves as a fundraiser to address the gap between the amount it actually costs to provide supports and the amount the state pays us to do so. There are two reasons for this widening gap. The first is that the state typically pays a fraction of the cost required to provide the mandated services. For example, to remain compliant with Rule 116, we must provide approximately 150 to 200 hours of nursing care for each individual we serve. The state reimburses us for 15 to 20 of those hours at a rate that was realistic 20 years ago. In addition, we provide services not required by the state, but certainly necessary to a quality of life. For example, the state does not cover the cost of replacing a bed or getting someone a new belt for a job interview or providing basic hygiene products, but we provide those supports. It also does not cover basic necessities like dental care, with the exception of extractions. It is the state's position that the only acceptable treatment for dental issues is pulling someone's teeth. We do not share that vision and consequently cover the cost of all dental care with the exception of extractions. And the state limits ostomy supplies to 20 days worth. Since there are no months with 20 days, we pay for a third of ostomy supplies. Most folks here are familiar with the workforce crisis agencies like Sparc are currently facing. At Sparc, we are competing with 3 hospitals and dozens of nursing homes and rehabilitation centers for workers. Springfield is also a regional shopping center, so we are also competing for workers with hundreds and hundreds of retail establishments, restaurants, and fast food places. Most of these places pay higher wages, but none require toileting assistance as part of the normal work duties. We also ask our workers to administer north of 20,000 medications a month, so it is not surprising that we are understaffed. Being understaffed is expensive. For each vacancy we have, we must pay a 50% premium in wages. Being understaffed is also dangerous. We need to remember that working double shifts can compromise health and safety standards. We do not want folks suffering from sleep deprivation passing medications. I am aware that appropriations are beyond the scope of the department's authority, but they must realize that the critical lack of funds has an impact where the rubber meets the road, and yet they seem oblivious to this reality. What I once considered unacceptable indifference toward the folks we support has deteriorated into a form of contempt. If a community agency calls or emails the department because one of its residents in a home has terrorized their housemates, they are unlikely to get any response. The fact that each of the other housemates are virtual prisoners in their bedrooms in their own home is of little interest to them. Very few of the staff have ever met a person with a developmental disability. Fewer still have any interest in their needs or well-being. The department has a section within the Division of Developmental Disabilities called Network. Community agencies are asked to submit their requests through Network. Network is the section where all requests and ideas go to die. Recently, we received word from the department that we must double the amount of abuse and neglect training we provide staff. Once again, we have this disconnect. The department is fully aware that we are in a financial crisis, but proceeds without regard for the fact that each person we retrain will be on overtime and that our training costs will nearly double. Some of you may be wondering where the families of these individuals are. More than 85% of the folks we support have no families. We are their family. I am here because we are looking for people who recognize the value of what we are doing and are willing to do something about it. Our pleas have fallen on deaf ears. We look to you for change. The folks we support look to you for change. To those of you who visit us recently, and there were several, thank you. Those of you who haven't, please come. Please come and see us. Come and see our homes. Come and see our work center. Come and see the folks we support on their job sites in the community. Just come and meet the folks we are talking about. I think it will change you. Thank you.